We're delighted to have you here today. Bern is the director of the Wayne County Dispute Resolution Center. So he came to his neighboring county, and we're delighted to welcome you.
I did, and I actually live in this neighboring county myself, so it was a short trip for me. I'm delighted to be here and glad to see you all. I know some of you I don't know, but looking forward to possibly getting to know you. One thing I do want to say is first, I do these at the Wayne County Dispute Resolution Center, and Joe's probably even attended one or two of such presentations. I think he got up and laughed after a few minutes out of anger. But no, but I very much like them to be an interactive group. I think we're kind of on the edge, but in terms of numbers, but I think we could still have, and I hope we will have an interactive group. What I like is having conversations and hearing different viewpoints, and so I hope that can be part of this.
This is a very talky group, so don't let
I
them take control.
I suspect it might be, and I'm very much used to that.
Get through with
That's not a problem. I have 5 kids, so I'm very used to being talked out of anything. No, just kidding. So anyway, I have actually given out all the copies, so if anyone else needs a copy, I think there's one extra one maybe there. So we may not need any more. We may have hit it just right, so that would be fine. So anyway, I am, as I say, delighted to be here, and I've given you a handout. I know you haven't had a chance to look at it ahead of time. So our conversation, and I already heard some interesting thoughts on anger and what that means. So I've got a couple things here. One is I really wanted to focus on, and I started thinking about this, of course, back in January, but I haven't left my house because of the weather since early January. So I put down notes, and I think I actually mentioned it to Belinda when we met in very early January, and I haven't been out since. So this is my first. So we're celebrating Martin Luther King Day. A couple of months late, even though it's still just as cold. It might as well be January. But at any rate, so what I'd like us to do, and again, looking forward to your participation, is talk about some of the quotes. We start out here from Martin Luther King Jr., of course, and I'm going to specifically talk a little bit more, although I did not copy it for you. We're going to talk a little bit about his letter from a Birmingham jail, which I don't know how familiar all of you are with it, but it's really quite an extraordinary document if you haven't read it recently since you were in school. And then also what we're going to talk about, time allowing, is there was an excellent article in the, I think, January edition of the Atlantic magazine. I don't know if any of you read. Pretty much everything they have is online, as far as I can tell. Wonderful articles. And this one is specifically on anger. So we're going to talk about that. And then, of course, what we're going to try to do is make the transference to make it actually useful and functional as mediators. And we're going to try to do that, and I hope that you all can help me do that. So first, I pulled some quotes, sort of my top, 12 or 15 quotes here from Martin Luther King Jr.'s works and speeches over the years. You may recognize some of them, I assume, and others you may not, but they sort of cover topics that I think are relevant to mediators and I think are very interesting. Let me ask you first, when you do a mediation, obviously we're dealing with conflict. People are there because they're in conflict. Tell me what you think, what drives, generally, what are the 2 most common things that drive that conversation? Some of you, I think, already said the ones that I would pick when we went around the room. Anybody have thought, what are the two main emotions and things that drive conflict? Anybody have a... Control, the need, desire for control.
Fear is
fear. That's definitely, and obviously anger that we talked about, and that feeds into it. So those are 3 things that really drive conflict. And obviously, if you think of more, let us know. And then, what I'd like to ask you is what you think in your experience. Of course, I know you all have mediated, and the key, what you have come to see as a key or two things that lead to resolving the conflict in the mediations that you've done. You didn't expect to be quizzed, did you? There's no right or wrong answer.
Being understood.
Understanding, good. Yeah. Reframing, that's one of the important skills, good. And that's part of understanding too, in sort of, well, that's sort of moving it, good. Any other thoughts?
Acknowledging the anger.
Say acknowledging
The anger.
the anger, good. There's one more big one. Think about it. You're allowed to cheat. You can read through the quotes and see if you see it. Compromising definitely is part of it.
I don't know, feeling heard, parts feeling heard.
Being heard, yeah. Yeah. What about forgiveness? To me, the one thing that moves a mediation further towards a solution is when one of the parties is willing to apologize or at least show forgiveness. And so forgiveness is I think, a critical component of resolving conflict. So there's lots of that in these quotes. I'll start at the top, and then, as I say, anybody can jump in and tell me what they think. First one is, I think, just a tremendous description. People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. How true is that? To me, when you talk about what people want out of mediation more than anything is to solve they need to reach an agreement. And when I do my training, and I know Belinda does yours here, I talk about actually what it's about isn't that. That may come about, but that's not really what it's about. It's about a conversation. So many people come and have not listened to each other at all, are afraid to talk to each other because of their fear. And when they have a neutral person that helps bring that conversation forward, move the conversation forward in a safe way, then anything is possible. And that's where things can start to happen. I just find that very, very true. Then the next one is, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. So that's obviously another wonderful quote. Next one is more about forgiveness is not an occasional act, it's a constant attitude. So often in mediation, there's an apology and a little bit of forgiveness, but then after you make a couple steps forward, then there's another step back. Imagine that. A button has been pushed that reminded them of something else that happened or that they feel this other person did. So it's an ongoing, constant attitude, just like he says. I think you've all heard this one. That old law about an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. The time is always right to do the right thing. Was that actually Gandhi who said that first? I can't remember. I think it might have been. The eye for an eye leaves everyone blind, but I can't remember. But anyway, it's a great quote. So then, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge. That might have gone around, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the Atlantic article. It makes some very interesting observations about that. Aggression and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Obviously, that's something that the thread that goes through a lot of these quotes. And in terms of thinking about it in mediation, love is the word that, to me, has lots of levels to it. And what we think about in mediation as a mediator is we think about connection and trust. Those are two things that are sort of predicates or some component of love. If there's trust and connection. So if you, as a mediator, can help build, as a bridge, can help build some trust and connection between parties, then you're making great, great progress. And to me, as I say, that fits there. Any thoughts? Anybody else? Okay.
I just have a question.
Yes, please.
Because, the Hammurabi law, an eye for an eye, actually was extreme justice. It was just take an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, do not take out a whole village.
Well, that's,
That was the idea.
yeah, yeah.
So the immeasurate
Mhm.
necessity of revenge is what was happening. And Hammurabi's law controlled that.
Mhm.
So it was the first step to restorative justice.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. That's what is wonderful to hear. So lots of more quotes here. I think, as I say, that you've probably heard before. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Some of these are just sort of quotes that you might wish were on your wall or playing in music or something, so that it would sort of sink in. Because obviously, you can only do so much as the mediator. I'm going to skip down a little bit and talk about a little further down. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. So that's very interesting, and that, of course, we might remember from Michelle Obama. It's kind of a somewhat of a twist on that. When they go low, we go high, kind of idea. And then more on love. And then, in the end, we seek a society at peace with itself that can live with its conscience. And then at the bottom of the page, connected to that, is true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. So, and then, as I say, some of these other quotes sort of feed in as well. Before I'm going to talk, this is a long quote from the letter from Birmingham Jail that I mentioned that we'll talk about in a minute. But there's a bonus quote that is not a Martin Luther King Jr. quote, but it was just so good. As I was working on this through the month of February, I had to. That's a hint. I had to put this in. I'll read it to you. Don't shout out. We'll see how many know this. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. People heard that before? Who can tell us who that is?
That's Abraham Lincoln.
Right. It's from his first inaugural address. I just love the words of that. To me are very similar. When I was putting together Martin Luther King Jr. quotes, I ran into that and thought, you know what, I like that so much.
Someone from a contemporary perspective is Leonard Cohen.
The songwriter?
Song, the
Yeah.
Hallelujah chorus.
Yes.
Hallelujah.
Uh-huh.
He says there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that is so.
Yeah, and
critical.
that's Martin Luther King Jr. talks a lot about darkness and light as well. It's a very common theme. Very good. Any other thoughts, questions on what we've talked about so far? As I say, feel free to jump in and spice things up. So the letter from a Birmingham jail. You may know about that. This was a very important piece of history. The nonviolent civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, went underway, and Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights folks decided to take actions without permits. They started marches and things like that, and of course got arrested. And so it became, a key aspect of the campaign. When this happened, there was a group, I guess, of the top clergy in Birmingham at the time, who were all white, who wrote and made it clear that they felt that these tactics were inappropriate and not right. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail as a result, and started. I think someone provided him I think what they wrote actually is in the newspaper, a letter to the editor maybe in the newspaper by these 9 clergy, and he wrote a response. He started out, the legend is he started out sort of writing it in the margins of that actual newspaper because he was in jail, and then eventually it turned into a just extraordinary letter, and I think I can't remember how many words it is, but you can see the little type. It's printed out on 5 pages. It went on and on and on. It's really like half a book. And it's just an extraordinary. Are people familiar with it? It may have been a while since you've seen it or thought about it.
I think I heard on NPR recently, did they talk about this?
They may well have.
That he really struggled with actually his anger
Yes.
to reach the place that he
That's
actually reached.
good. Thank you. That's exactly right. And that's the point. And then, as I say, we're going to talk in a minute about anger and what this Atlantic article says, which I found fascinating, and I sort of broke it down for you. It's also like a book, this article in the Atlantic. Occasionally the articles are. So he does some amazing things in it. So this is what he does is he responds to these the clergy, and he does some amazing things in it. He starts out by complimenting them. He first says, "I normally wouldn't respond to criticism. I get so much of it, I don't have time. But you are so important and so smart and wonderful people, I'm going to respond to you. And that's why I'm writing this letter. You are men of genuine goodwill, and your criticisms are sincerely set forth. I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient, there's patience, and reasonable terms." So you can imagine, as somebody mentioned, the anger that he must feel. He's in jail. And the people that he at least feels might be somewhat supportive and are critical, perhaps, to moving to the next levels, are not supporting him at all. He then, in the next piece of it, he actually reminds them and uses the phrase "tied in a single garment of destiny." So he sort of reminds them that we're all in this together. So these, again, we're trying to make the transference to thinking about it as mediators. Compliments always go a long way. I hear what you're saying. You're important. It sounds like you're a very thoughtful person who's thought about things and want good things. And then, recognize that that there's this. We're all in this together, and that this is important. And then. He also talks about how he's caught between forces. So the forces here are, there's no question that changes need to come. And the question is that he presents is, do you want that change to come from, and I think he actually even cites, I'm sorry, my memory's going a little blank here, who was sort of the other, Muhammad, who am I thinking, the black, Malcolm X, kind of, or along those lines. So there's your choice. There's Elijah Muhammad. Thank you. So there's your choice. It's between that and what I'm proposing is actually a middle ground. Is here, and negotiation is part of where we go. We tried to negotiate. We put this off. They actually were going to get involved in the election. I think Bull Connor was involved. Everybody's heard that name, I'm sure. And so they were going to get, but they decided we're not going to get involved in the election. We're going to wait till after. They were going to do it at Christmas time first, and then they said, well, we'll wait. And they ended up around Easter time, I think, in the spring. So they made lots of efforts to try to do things. So that was part of it. But so he sort of talked about there's complacency where things don't change and things don't get done, or he said the other alternative here is sort of hatred. So the question is whether you go for the hatred or whether you go for the love, is the way he poses it. And then towards the end, so he goes through a long litany of why he feels this is justified and why it's happening and why it's important. But then he says towards the end, if I misstated anything or shown any impatience here, I ask your forgiveness. So again, another very useful tool in persuasion and engaging with people. Always be willing to say, maybe I heard that wrong. I'd like to hear your response to that, and I want to make sure that I get this right. I want to make sure that I'm really listening to you. If I don't get it right, I'm sorry about that, and I'll try harder. So another great thing. And then at the very end, the last thing he does is he expresses optimism. So another wonderful and important aspect of a way to be an effective mediator. I don't think I, or probably most of us, can come up with nearly as much as good words as these. But he says, his last sentence is, "Let us hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty." So that's kind of a little bit more than I would expect from the average mediator, but nevertheless, just what a great way to end, with optimism. How important is optimism in mediating between people in complicated conflicts? Very, very important. And so he's hit all kinds of wonderful notes that I think are well worth considering. Any thoughts or other observations? All right.
I was just going to say, for me, it's very powerful to know that, again, I already said this, that he struggled with his anger to
Yes.
arrive there.
Yes.
He was telling you he just was there. He had
That's
to work
right.
through a lot of
That's right.
feelings to get there.
That's right. And it makes you think about the non-judgmental aspect of what an effective mediator, which again to me is really about being a communicator and a bridge. How effective was he? The fact that he could be non-judgmental about them as individuals and just focus on, here are the facts. Let's talk about the facts, and that's what he does in this letter. It's really quite amazing. Any other thoughts before we talk about anger? So we can do a break off into groups, and then we can start. You can do some punching, or I can just keep talking about the article. So maybe I'll opt for option 2. So as I say, this is an amazing article in the Atlantic about anger, as I say, I read it. It's a very long article. I encourage you to read it. But I summarized it, and I tried to summarize it in a way. I put it in categories of some of the things they said, which I found very interesting. I broke it down into, I think it's 5 categories that I thought we could focus on as mediators. The first one is why people get angry. And what I felt was really interesting about this is actually quite different than my experience, but it's really made me think about things. Because as a mediator, I don't like it when people show anger in front of me. When I'm doing a mediation, if a party's angry, my reaction is always, which I think is a lot of mediators, is try to tone them down. And don't get angry, don't talk that way. We have rules in mediation, so we're not going to raise our voice or do that sort of thing. But what this talks about are recent studies that actually say anger is a very good thing in many ways, and has a very important part of our civil discourse, which we've had a couple mediators who always said when they were in mediation, what they look for is someone really to lose it and get angry and cry. And once they've done that, they feel like it's smooth sailing. And I've never really gone on that philosophy or thought that way. But then I read this article, and so what this talks about is, so there's this guy. He's he's in academia, a psychology professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and the prevailing thought, apparently to the mid-'70s, is, and I think it still prevails in many ways, is that anger is a bad thing, right? Anger is something, if you're angry, you're not in control of your emotions, and you're not, it's not a good thing. It's used for a bad purpose. And what he found was, so he did a survey, sent it out, he picked out this community that was sort of the average run-of-the-mill American town that was doing pretty well financially, economically, and he sent out surveys about anger. How often you get angry, and how does it look like, and how does it work? And he got a barrage of responses. He couldn't believe it. They just kept coming and coming and coming. And the people all said, and it goes to some detail about this guy, actually sort of sees himself as someone who doesn't have a bad temper at all. He's someone very even-tempered. But these people, everybody was just saying, I just let them have it. I get it out. There was one example they used as a woman whose husband was cheating on her. And she found out because he bought a new car and he took it to her and showed her. And she said, I wasn't really mad that he was having an affair with me because I didn't really like him much. And it was, boy, it's her problem if she wants to deal with my husband. But what really made her mad was that he showed her the new car to his lover before he showed it to me. That made her mad. So he found out. This started apparently a sort of a turning in psychology academia, where they started really thinking about, well, what role does anger really play, and why do people have so much anger? And what he found from his work was that actually anger doesn't often make things worse. It often makes bad situations better, people said, and they resolved rather than exacerbated their tensions. And it's made them more willing to listen, more inclined to speak honestly, more accommodating of each other's complaints. People reported that they tended to be much happier after yelling at an offending party. They felt relieved, more optimistic about the future, and more energized. The ratio of beneficial consequences was about 3-to-1 for angry persons. So what he realized from this, the conclusion he came to, was that anger actually has the reason why there's so much anger to some extent is that it's a very important human emotion. It allows us to express what we want more quickly and without filter sometimes in ways that we need to. So he found that fascinating. He says, he concluded, anger is the densest form of communication. It conveys more information more quickly than almost any other type of emotion. And it does an excellent job of forcing us to listen and confront problems we might otherwise avoid. So I found that really interesting. He also found, this is on to page 2 of the summary here, and I put in bold the main things I'm going to talk about here. When we become angry, we feel like we're taking control, like we're getting power over something. That was something that I can't remember who raised it, but someone along here raised that. Watching angry people as viewers of reality television, though, is highly entertaining. And so expressing anger is a surefire method for capturing the attention of an otherwise indifferent crowd. So
It's all from the standpoint of the person who's angry.
Right.
Well, that's, yeah.
I'm just going to say, I'm sure it would make me feel great if I'm pissed off and I can rant and rave at you.
Yeah.
But the trick is,
how does the other person feel?
Exactly the same reaction in
Yeah.
you that I'm displaying.
That's
Then
right.
where the hell are you?
Well, that's the question. And so we'll get to that in a minute. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And that's about anger being used effectively. So what we're talking about here is don't be afraid of anger necessarily.
You're making me angry, Bert.
No, I can tell, and I do not want when Joe's angry. So it's really an important emotion that shouldn't purely be squelched. That's the main point of this first part, and something to think about. But we'll get to this. And here's the transition to this. The scholarship, the article says, the scholarship of this professor and successor shows how ordinary anger can be sharpened, manipulated, and misdirected, and how difficult it is for us to resist this. Under certain conditions, the emotion can transform from a force that helps keep society knitted together into something that tears it apart. And that's where we'll go in a minute. That's what we're talking about. The concluding thing here at the bottom of page 2, ordinary anger can deepen under the right circumstances into moral indignation, a more combustible form of the emotion, though one that can still be a powerful force for good. And we're going to talk about that as well. If moral indignation persists, however, and if the indignant lose faith that their anger is being heard, it can produce a third type of anger, a desire for revenge. So that's the latter. And the feeling that it's okay to punish people. When you have that feeling of revenge, you feel that that's the only way to do it, to be heard or to make it better, then you don't care about punishing people. So that's important. So the next section of this article, it talks about anger as a positive. And this is our link as well to the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King. This article actually, although it mentions Martin Luther King Jr. And has a couple quotes from him, what it really focuses on, though, is Cesar Chavez. Are people familiar with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers campaign out in California? So, the point of this part of the article is that actually anger it can be a very useful emotion when it's put in a nice path. And Cesar Chavez is an example of that. Things were not going well with his campaign. These workers working for no money. They're treated horribly. Were really struggling, getting more and more angry. And so Cesar Chavez stepped in and sort of organized them, and what he did is he gave them something to do. He said, we're going to march. I think they're going to march from downstate all the way to the Capitol. And they said, well, that's a ridiculous idea. That'll take days. You'll starve on the road, and what a dumb thing. What does that do? Well, it did a lot. It brought together, people started to pay attention, and people said, I want to participate in that. I feel like there's a reason I'm doing something. And that was a key aspect of it, was that if people feel that their anger is going to something that's productive and useful, it gets them from complacency that we talked about to action and to doing something. And that's a key aspect of solving conflict. And so one thing they also talk about in this, it goes back to the East India Company mutiny, which I think is a very famous historical event in the mid-1800s, going back a little bit. Anybody remember that one? No, not I. But I remember reading about it a little bit. But anyway, so there was, again, horrible conditions, and these workers in the East India Company having to do terrible things, treated horribly by British troops and things like that. But then all of a sudden, things exploded. 2/3 of their company's regiments broke out into a violent rebellion. And the reason they did a bunch of research and pulled out all kinds of records, I guess about 10 years ago, they say, is they found out that what happened was they started messing with religious, it was on top of all the horrible treatment, was they actually started they were requiring soldiers to do things with their weapons that involved beef, tallow, and pig fat. And so Hindu or Muslims, which were most of the workers, all of a sudden it became a violation of their religious tenets, and they were being forced to do that. So when that happened, the clergy got involved, and they actually exploded, and they just said, I'm going to do something about this, and that anger turned into the rebellions. They don't say what the end result of the rebellions is, that I recall, but anyway, it's that righteous anger. So Cesar Chavez, going back to him, he did lots of things, and they also talk about that it was a very it's a very difficult thing to balance, because what happened after this march, they made some steps forward, and then people got really frustrated again. And what Cesar Chavez did again to get their attention was he went on a starvation thing. So he said, I'm not going to eat. So because what was happening was actually these workers were getting mad. They started to do violent things and get arrested in ways that weren't helping with the movement. So he turned the attention to him and said, I'm not going to eat. I'm going to go on a starvation diet until things change. And then people started to watch him and started to participate in that and understand that. And that also took away the anger from a negative to putting it into a positive light. So,
I just have a question.
Yes.
But what happens, so all the revolutions are motivated by righteous anger.
Yes.
But what happens when the revolution, this is peaceful reaction or channeling of the righteous anger. But what happens when it results in violence?
Well, yes. Well, and as I say, that's the thin line between nonviolence and violence. And what happened after Martin Luther King was shot? If you lived in Detroit area, you know what happened, right? And you lived in any other major urban areas. The tension of someone who shows that there's a path forward, when that is no longer in sight, then people give up and they start to say just what we talked about: revenge and violence is acceptable. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. fought about so much, and that's why the intricate relationship that he had with other black leaders who were very much interested in, we waited too long, this is ridiculous. But then once he died, then things turned a different way in their leadership. And the same with Chavez, as I say, after that march and they made some progress, and then people started saying he had to bring the attention back to him. You had to have a lightning rod, or whatever you want to call it, of somebody who is showing them it is worth moving forward. There's a path forward here.
So, along with that, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian sociologist, he figured out still another way of channeling righteous anger. And of course, the workers, the illiterate workers with whom he worked, were mad at their bosses. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to be just like their bosses, mm-hmm. so they could be as mean as their bosses. Yeah. And Paulo Freire showed them there was another way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so his illiterate workers, in becoming literate, mm-hmm. also became nonviolent because mm-hmm. they didn't want to be like their bosses. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think there was a third way, and I think that's what we're doing, right, in mediation.
Thank you for making that point. That's exactly right. Yeah. So, so another interesting thing is that many corporations actually use anger as a strategy. And what this article talks about is how debt collectors use it as a strategy. Has anybody ever been called by a debt collector? Well, what their strategy is, they get you on the phone, and as soon as they can get you on the phone, they start yelling at you. You're a no good for nothing deadbeat. You need to pay this bill and this and that. And you, of course, react to that, saying, you're a horrible person, I'm not paying a penny, you're a jerk, This is the actual strategy they have. So then once they get the person to lose their temper, then they step back and become nice. And they say, let's talk about how we can move this forward. I hear what you're saying. I can tell that, maybe I haven't been so nice here or whatever. Maybe we can talk about this. And they said it works fabulously. So this is actually according to this article, this is the strategy of the debt collection industry. And so once people have gotten it out and lost their temper, then they basically, you get them angry and aroused, then you deliver catharsis and a sense of relief. I'm really not so bad. I'm not going to really put you in jail like I originally threatened or whatever. So they find that actually then people will say, well, I'll make a deal. Okay, I'll pay 50% next month and 50% the month after or whatever. That's their actual strategy, according to this article.
Good cop, bad cop.
It's very similar, isn't that? That's exactly
It's not so nice.
No, it's not. And of course, it's not something we use as a mediator.
It's just manipulative.
That's exactly right, and that's the debt collection industry. So, but anyway, this is just all useful to think about and understand as a mediator because it presents things in a very different way.
Carol, let's handle that.
Yeah.
I just finished reading the Book of Joy, which is a conversation between Desmond Tutu and anyway, Desmond Tutu is the important one.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was talking about when he was chairing the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, that when they started hearing when people got up to testify and talk about what happened to them and why it happened and really tearing each other apart, then they would get up and they would dance and they would sing. And that conversation began to change when people were able to move and react to what they were hearing and to celebrate the fact that they were there and that there was a possibility for change in their future. That was a marvelous insight for me to think about.
Yeah, that's amazing. Excellent thought. Any other thoughts? Very, very good thoughts. Very good thought. So again, as a mediator, we're not suggesting this as strategy, but it's interesting to know about that, to think about that. So again, going back to the original thought was when people are angry and shout a little bit or show their anger, that may be a useful thing. Again, I'm not talking about poking them or prodding them, but most people you don't have to, right? How, tell us about, tell us about your side of this, and they'll, they'll become very animated and let the other person have it. But the thing to think about is maybe there's a place for that, but then maybe it needs, at what point you as a mediator make the judgment of when do I pull back. Again, the last two pieces on this is revenge is anger plus a lack of hope. So when people feel that there's no hope, that they feel they're not being listened to, then revenge is their primary factor. And so that, again, tells you, think about the process of mediation. What is the first part of mediation generally focused on? Building trust, right? You build trust and you listen, you reflect back, you make it clear that you care what they have to say and that you're thinking about what they have to say and that you're responding to what they have to say, and you build trust. And that leads them, perhaps, with the thought that this process might actually lead to something useful. So many people come to mediation and you hear, well, this is a waste of time, this is ridiculous, there's no way we're going to resolve this. They're just such an awful person and they've done so many horrible things, they're never going to change. And then when they sit down in mediation and you tell them about the process, you let them know how the process can work and what it could do, then they start little by little maybe, or sometimes they're all in and just do it they're part of a process. But you convince them it's not the same as when they're in the courtroom. This is an opportunity for you. You use positive, optimistic kind of words. You compliment them in appropriate ways. Then they start to feel differently, and then that part of their brain starts to open up a little bit. They start to think a little bit differently about things. So again, when there's this aspect of revenge and the lack of hope, then there's no chance of moving forward. If you can't break that, then you're going to be at an impasse, most likely. But that, you never know when that comes, right? Have you ever had an experience? I have this happen all the time in mediation, where I come in and one side is really angry and awful and terrible for the first hour and a half, and the other side seems very reasonable and just sort of, I just want to resolve it and move forward. And then the angry person starts to open up and starts to put ideas on the table and starts to become far more engaged and willing to compromise. And then all of a sudden the other side decides, it's my turn. I am going to be angry and nasty and difficult. I see that happen all the time. So you never know how it's going to flow. I mean, it's just patience and understanding, and think about, it's useful to think about how anger works, why it might work that way, and how you can push through anger. So a last thing that they talk about that I also thought was fascinating, and again, the author pulled all this together, whether it holds up to other studies and things like that, but I found it just fascinating. So where do you think you could go to do a study that would be that would really reach a conclusion about anger to Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians in the where the settlements are being built? That's where the anger is really there. So a social scientist did an experiment in a Tel Aviv suburb, and they picked this area because these were the most adamant anti-Palestinian groups, and it was Gaza and the West Bank settlements and things like that. So what they did, instead of telling them, how unreasonable they were or how awful they were, they actually did an ad campaign, and they used an advertising agency. And what they did is they actually ran commercials taking their position an extra step further. So they talked about why war is so important. It's so important that we're at war with these groups, because when this creates heroes for us. So this is why we need war, because we need heroes. And they come from war. and they scored it with Wagner's Flight of the Valkyries. And then they did a soldier with a machine gun petting a kitten and an infantryman helping an old man cross the street. What a wonderful world played in the background. And it said, without war, we would never be moral. For morality, we need the conflict. So they took it to that extreme. And what they found, so they did a study. They then went in and did a study on their attitudes after that. And they found that this actually had a huge impact on the people that lived there, that they actually started to shift the perceptions. And the reason was because somehow these ads made them realize somewhat the absurdity of taking this to extremes, and that there were actually other aspects that they could consider. And it apparently had a lasting effect. And they did studies, the residents of those villages versus some other ones, and found, so it wasn't just the time. The other ones, they maintained the same level of anger or antagonism, whereas in those villages, they actually shifted. There was a significant shift in their opinions.
Was there in the article a discussion on whether the folks in that town, that suburb, had a personal realization, or was this a subliminal, semi-conscious adjustment they were making? Did it say anything about that?
That's a good question.
Because I
don't
have a
think so.
feeling it was not conscious, not a
Well,
conscious decision.
So I'll tell you what. Yeah, it's in here. There and then here.
Was it? I mean, it almost sounds satirical to me.
Well, that's what it was. That's what they said. The social scientists said instead of telling people they were wrong, the ads agreed with them to embarrassing, offensive extremes, and that opened their minds. But I'll tell you what the poll said.
I hate to be a cynic about this, but
cynic in our midst.
It seems to me that it might be a subtle manipulation of a scapegoating mechanism, that you posit a mythical extremist so that I can say, well, geez, I'm better than that. I mean, it automatically creates an adverse reflex that's going to put you in a better position.
Yeah.
But it's a use of a very basic hardwiring that we all have to deal with that's at play.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. And as I say, this is one study, so take it. The article weaves it in.
I see this sort of also as something we do in mediation, when you say, it sounds like you're really pissed off.
Yeah.
And then the person's like, well, no, actually, I'm not pissed off. I'm just upset that this happened. And so it's also putting a mirror to them where it might seem pissed.
Putting a mirror. That's exactly. I think you've hit a great point there. You put a mirror. Sometimes that makes a difference with people. And that's part of why you reflect back as well, right? You let people hear. So what I hear you saying, and maybe you reframe it a little bit, but what I hear you saying is that this person is such an awful person that you don't care if you go to jail and that his dog destroys your yard every week. You just want to move forward with this. So that's exactly right. So here's what they found. Again, take it for what it's worth in terms of whether it means that much. It said the percentage of right-leaning residents who said Arabs were solely responsible for Israel's past wars decreased by 23%. The number of conservatives who said Israel should be more aggressive toward Palestinians fell by 17%. Incredibly, even though the advertisements never mentioned settlements, 78% more people said that Israel should consider freezing construction in the West Bank and Gaza. And residents in the nearby towns who hadn't seen the same ads showed no such evolution in their views. So again, there's always there's always the chance that things don't hold up and that there's explanations for them. But I just thought it was fascinating, and as I say, it's a long read. You can read it online. As I say, it's a long article, and it tells a lot of personal aspects of things and goes off on some tangents. But I thought it was worth summarizing and thinking about. So maybe in the time left, I'd like to hear from you what you think. I mean, the other piece of information I've given you is just a short, very short one-page article from Tips for Dealing with Emotion and Mediation from mediate.com. If you're not if you're not listed with them, they send you an email of the articles every week if you sign up. There's no cost to it, and they have some really really interesting articles sometimes. But anyway, so here's one on emotional literacy for mediators, talking a little bit. So reflecting on this, what are folks' thoughts in terms of does it change how you think about anger at all, and what it could mean as a mediator? Again, I've heard a couple warning flags about manipulation, right? I mean, the balance of our job as the mediator is to be a neutral and to not be a force. There's a whole batch of literature on that issue of how mediators can be manipulative. And again, that's why I think it's really important to think about mediation isn't necessarily about getting a solution that day at the table that way in the long term, but it's about increasing the communication, improving the communication, and maybe the understanding a little bit.
So as I was listening to this, Bern and the comments around anger, I'm just wondering if some of our behavior as mediators have something to do with our orientation around conflict and anger. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the uprising of Detroit in 1967, which is the year I was born. So I was kind of born into this very chaotic, high emotion period of Detroit's history, and actually lived walking distance from where it all started. Mm-hmm. We were on Seward, things started around the Claremont area. So, I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I think everything is connected. So I have a level of comfort with people with raised voices, spewing off a little anger, getting it off their chest. That's how I see it. It's not. I don't see it as being destructive.
Right.
In the early stages of the process, I see it as very helpful that they can kind of blow off that steam, and somehow, some way, we get to that calmer emotion where they can start really problem solving. So I have actually seen it more of a strategy than a destructive element. Having said that, I realize I don't mediate as much as the folks around this table. Just not allowed to do so. But that's how I've seen it. Like, people just need an opportunity to to get it off their chest. And again, I just grew up in as a teenager. If you have teenage kids, we have bad attitudes. So, and I just remember how my family interacted with me. It was never squashed. Like, don't be mad. Don't, try to make me happy. It was like, oh, she's mad right now. She's in her feelings. Work through it. It's okay. Work through it, Belinda. You'll be okay. You'll be okay. Or they would say, you run nothing but your mouth, and it's okay. It's okay. But I was allowed to express that emotion, just as other emotions that that we want to see our kids happy and all of that. So it's just, I don't know. I just feel like that's a big piece of it as well.
Absolutely.
What we all bring to the situation as well.
I think you were first.
I was going to say that what that sparks for me is, as a mediator, we need to be conscious of what our biases are and where we're coming to the table with. Right. Because for some people, anger may set them off right away, and for other people, they may see it as, okay, well, we're just going to go with this for a little bit and see what happens. Right. I know one of the things that happened a lot in Puerto Rico, where I was working last year, there were a lot of people from the mainland who were in Puerto Rico working with people from Puerto Rico. Right. And one of the conflicts that kept coming up was people from the mainland saying, well, they're always angry. It's like, well, no. And then once you get them talking, it was like, well, no, we're not angry. We're just
That's the way we,
That's how we talk.
Yeah.
And so
we get that.
Right.
Yeah.
So being aware of where our biases are and where the biases of our participants might be also.
Excellent points. Good thoughts here, and then back there, and then up here.
And so as a mediator, my challenge has always been how long to let this go on.
Yes.
And not to, I feel like the expression of the anger, as you were describing, is fine. It doesn't make me anxious.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue for me is always, okay, when are we wasting our time here?
Right.
When are we generating a higher level of anger than maybe what we started with? I mean, making some of these judgments, I think, is the challenge.
That is exactly the challenge, and I have a thought on that, but I want to hear what you all have.
So I wonder then, because to me, there are people who are very, very in favor of shuttle diplomacy.
That was...
But to me, that is antithetical to giving people an opportunity to vent their anger. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, that's actually what my thought was on that, but I wanted, someone else had a hand. Was it?
I was just, when I think about mediation, I think of myself as a sounding board, because getting people to at least be listened to, and sometimes that is the most important and helpful thing that you can do, is to be able to acknowledge someone's anger and then put it into greater context.
Excellent. Good thoughts. So, did you go ahead?
Well, I do have a question that you can add to
Yes.
the response to these other two.
Yes.
Is it appropriate, and how does one introduce the concept of forgiveness?
That's a great thought as well. And the answer starts out to me both in the same way. So the compromise to me, and again, I will start with, and I think this is an essential part of being as being the best you can be, is understanding your own biases and your own personality and how you react to things. So I am the thing that sort of causes me, my brain not to work well the quickest is when people get angry. That's my upbringing or for whatever reason. And so as a mediator early on, I tried to shut it down, just what I was talking about for the reasons we talk about. But so here's the compromise I came up with, and here's why, and it has to do with what you've raised. I actually do shuttle diplomacy at the first part of the mediation. And the reason is to build the trust. I have found, first of all, when people are first there, their emotions are the highest. And so if they can let me have it, and I can see what their buttons are, and I can respond to them and build some trust in myself and the process, it is much more productive when I eventually bring them together. And so that, to me, is my compromise. So I caucus, if I sense high emotion, or I know from the facts in the case already that's likely to be high emotion, I actually do a breakout caucus right after I've done my introduction. Right after I've had the consent to agreement, I go straight. I say, I haven't met either of you before. I don't know what your situations are, and I'd like to learn more. And here's how I'd like to start. And I take them in a private room. As I say, I test their buttons a little bit, but the main thing I'm doing is eye-to-eye contact and building trust with them. And I find when they do that, and then I could reframe things a little bit for when we get back. And then I do that obviously with both sides, and then I bring them together. And I give it a go, and sometimes I use the reframing I use my judgment depending on the situation, but I let them, it's still, in many cases, there's going to be some anger there, and I let it go a little bit, but if it doesn't stop, then, and unfortunately a lot of people really can no longer have, with people they're in conflict with, they just can't have civil conversations with. It just, their buttons are so high. So if that's necessary, then I take them apart. But my goal is always to bring them back together for just the reasons that you talk about. If they're really going to settle it in a good way and move forward, they're going to have to be able to communicate. But if my judgment is, and again, this is what I struggle the most with, because I say, my brain tells me if they're angry, then it's not going to be effective. And I have to pull back on that. But so that's what I'll do. It takes the process longer, unfortunately. But I have never, once I figured that out, and I do a lot of mediations, I have found that by far that is the best way for me as a mediator to deal with it. It's sort of the compromise I came up with in order to be more effective.
I'll add another procedural thing that occasionally the DRC does. So sometimes we get a referral of a case that we know is a highly emotional case. We've heard some things on the call with each of the parties that prompt the staff to have an in-person intake. Again, building trust, trying to get some feelers, looking at body language, those kinds of things, and maybe diffusing some things.
Exactly.
Maybe participant something to think about, some homework to do in the meantime as we're going through the coordination of the case.
Yep.
But I think that early touch point and intervention and face-to-face does help.
I completely agree, and where actually where I figured out to do that most was in domestic cases. How many of y'all do domestic cases?
I used to, but I don't know.
And that's, you have to because of domestic violence. I use that screen. I don't just read. I don't read the screening thing at all. I do all the questions, but I weave it. I build trust and relationship with them because first of all, to find out if there's true domestic violence, sometimes you have to build their trust first. So I want to do that. Anyway, Joe, you've been anxious to jump in.
I certainly don't disagree with either you or Belinda have said. Some mediators use that technique regardless of whether they see anger on the horizon.
Right.
Zena Zametta, for example, I think Zametta, of course, prefers to meet separately with the parties to establish rapport,
yes.
trust,
okay.
Take temperatures and all that kind of stuff. But that assumes you have the luxury of time and,
that's right.
and resources to engage in that kind of endeavor.
I agree. That's right. And I will tell you, some of the best mediators around, and I remember this from the I think it's the Harvard, the getting to yes and all that, the Harvard thing. Many of their leading mediators say you never should do a caucus at all. They will never mediate. They will never go to caucus. And I find that extraordinary and respect that. But personally, as I say, I just know with my personal makeup, I can't most effectively function that way. But yeah, it really comes down to you and what your learned success is, trying different things and being with your personal.
And I would say certainly probably in the civil cases that makes sense. In small claims, which a lot of us only do.
Okay.
You don't know the level of anger when you come in.
Right.
You have no clue.
Yes.
So you can't, you could maybe judge it after they've launched into their
opening
perspective on what brings them here today.
Right.
But
right. And so so there's all kinds of flexible options there. I don't do much small claims. I haven't done it for years. But, and again, it depends on our experience at a lot of our small claims courts. They really don't want you in there for more than half an hour, which I find, and our mediators find very challenging. But they're lined up in the hallway. But you could do, as I say, you could do the introduction, yours. If you don't sense a high level of antagonism, you could let them do their statements, and then you could say, all right, now we've heard you both. Let's jump into caucus. Again, lots of very good mediators say you've got it backwards. You only go to caucus after you've tried everything in person. As I say, I do the flip, and the reason is the cases that we do, that I've always done, are very high emotion issues. I have done so few cases that didn't involve that. I did one recently, which was a general civil case, but we don't really do very many of those, and I don't do the small claims. I haven't done that in a long time, so that does present a different dynamic a little bit if there's a time crunch, especially. But it's a balancing.
We don't have a time crunch here.
You don't. Well, then if they're there and they're willing to be there for a couple hours, then to me this works again, because if you do it quick, but the other key to it is the way I'm talking about early on. If you're doing this, what I'm saying, it can't go on for hours and hours, and it really takes discipline to say it from the start. So I want to make sure they're out waiting in the waiting room. In a few minutes, you're going to be out waiting in the waiting room, and since I haven't even talked to them yet, I don't want you to have to sit out there for hours. So I hope you don't mind, but I might push you a little bit in terms of after you've gotten a good opportunity to tell me what your side of this is and why we're here and what you would like to see happen here. So you sort of set things up, and then diplomatically, and then sometimes I've had to, so as I told you, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I just want to make sure that waiting out in the waiting room is difficult, and you're going to be in that position in a minute, and I want to be fair. So you just, as long as you say that, I've never had anybody raise any
One thing you
issues.
haven't mentioned is safety. I always felt that the mediation has to be in a safe
Yes.
place for
Yes.
all of the parties.
Absolutely.
Where there's been a history of domestic violence, let me finish.
Yeah.
That when we do the domestic violence protocol,
Yes.
that sometimes leads to it's the mediator's call.
Yes.
This is not an appropriate case
Mhm.
at this time for mediation.
Right.
Because it's not safe.
Exactly.
And the other thing, I've had cases where the other party who's violent is calm as a cucumber.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Just,
Yeah, yeah.
everything's just fine, and you just know as soon as this is over, he's going to let her have it.
Yep. Or even this calmness is a strategy to get, because she'll be so frustrated, because people think when they're in mediation, I have to prove to the mediator I'm the righteous person and they're not. And when that person can hide that I've had people in domestic cases absolutely claim there was no domestic violence whatsoever. And when it says in the file, well, you've pled guilty twice to domestic violence. How do you explain that? I just pled to get rid of it, and it was just this. So again, as a mediator, I don't make a judgment about their honesty or whatever, but I do make a judgment that there's something there that makes this inappropriate for mediation.
At this time and in this place, maybe there's another...
Well, and here, so here's the thing. We do most of our domestic actually at the courthouse. So the sheriffs are right there, and what we do is we actually take it right to the judges when we're done, either to do a settlement conference or to end it. And so the judges are supposed to flag them for domestic violence and actually talk with the parties if there is any evidence. Some of them do not do that at all. So we're left with just what you're saying, is having to make a very difficult decision because sadly, domestic violence, there is, when you actually do the protocol, there is domestic violence in a huge percentage of cases, whether it's just emotional or actual physical. It's
just emotional is very violent.
That's right. Well, it clearly impacts the playing field in terms of being able to get them to work together. Lots of good thoughts. This side of the table, this side of the room has been a little bit quieter. I want to give you a full opportunity to express.
I recently took a workshop and one of the NBC trainers that was teaching about trauma, and then she was talking about experiencing the clean anger versus experiencing, I don't want to say dirty anger, but the kind of an anger that is directed, towards someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And she had us just experience in our body, and just how experiencing the anger, that energy that comes up, and then you just feel it. It's not about anybody else, it's just feeling the energy that is there.
Yeah.
It's very different than just one thing. Maybe if the mediator can
distinguish,
help to just support the person that is angry, to just feel that energy inside of them.
Good. Excellent point. Excellent thoughts. Any other thoughts along?
I was working in a counseling center in domestic relations court in Cincinnati, Ohio, and seeing people, every hour or so. And this couple came in, they had the time wrong, and so they came in an hour ahead of time. And the anger was so intense in that room. The secretary had to get up and leave. She just couldn't stand to be there. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And so one part of my brain was thinking of them as I was working with the person that I was with. And when I went out to the room, they said, we've settled this, so we'll come in and we'll tell you what we decided. But we haven't been in a room together for 4 years, and once we were able to talk, we were able to figure things out. Talk about the power of communication.
Yeah. And sometimes that's all it takes. Again, and that's to me that's the magic of mediation, actually, isn't that we're brilliant or, really what it's about is we're patient and we listen and we're patient over and over again, and that we make some judgments about the process in terms of what we've got these tools in our toolkit that we can use, but in the end, it's really about them. What buttons get hit in the right way? Are they are they at a place to move on? And as you said, if it may not be in this room at this time, but at least if they've seen through a tiny baby step, then you never know what happens after that.
One of the clerks in a court that we just started the mediation process took the mediation training, and she said, my time is so much doubled now because I used to have to spend hours of my time listening to people who said nobody listened to me in court. And that I don't get those calls anymore once you've started mediating here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really true. I used to, I was an attorney, and I used to, I worked at legal aid, so I used to represent 99%. We only did the cases if there was allegations of domestic violence, and represent the women. And what I did as a matter of strategy, and I loved doing it, was doing a deposition of the other side, generally the husband. And I'd go into the deposition and I'd just listen. I wouldn't cross-examine them like Perry Mason or, say anything terrible about them. My goal was just to build a little relationship with them. And by the end of the deposition, they would follow, I had it several times, they'd follow me out in the parking lot and say, keep wanting to talk to me. And I'd say, but you've got a lawyer. I'm the lawyer for the other party. Do you understand that? And they literally didn't. They said, but my attorney doesn't listen to me. He doesn't have time. And I'd say, well, but that's the point, is that people never underestimate the value of being a good listener. I mean, that really makes so much difference. But it is so difficult to do. My wife will tell you that I fail at it on many occasions, and that's why we have a couch in the living room. But it really, really makes a difference on all levels, and it really is. It is well worth practicing and thinking. It takes practice. Honestly, is what it does. It's work. I mean, it really is work.
I just following up on that point. One of my takeaways from this is to try to continue to be as much of a compassionate listener as possible, because sometimes that alone is the antidote to some of that destructive anger. And I think I don't have a lot of experience with super high emotion, but I have some, and I find that one of the insights, I guess, is that you need to allow people the choice to either hang on to that or not. And so sometimes just by listening compassionately and letting them decide if it's the way they want to continue or maybe back away from it, seems to help it move a bit.
Absolutely. I think that's a great strategy. And that's why, as I say, I would never take the position to never caucus, because sometimes caucusing for just that reason is what it is. And you really don't know until the person has had an opportunity to release some of it and talk. And then you may make the judgment that after a while that they're just not in a place to get past it. And that is especially true when they're in the same room with the person, unfortunately. And so that does happen sometimes. I mean, I have been in some mediations where literally within the first 3 minutes, they're like getting up because there's somebody, just hearing the other side made them so angry. But then you can get them back and work through it.
So Kathy's question about introducing the concept of forgiveness.
Oh, I'm sorry, I never answered.
Which may be coupled with, I think maybe this is coupled with what you're asking. Is it appropriate ever to introduce the concept of apologizing?
That's a great question. I'd like to hear what you all have to say. I'll tell you what my opinion is, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have any of you done that? Have you ever talked about an apology?
Yeah, it's difficult to know when. I mean, it's a lot of it is. I mean, it's more art than science. I think in terms of figuring out whether whether you can broach the subject. But I mean, it's a great tactic if you, but only if there are several elements to a sound apology.
Right.
If it's not a sound apology,
it's
research
worse.
indicates that a half-ass apology is probably worse than none.
It
you know,
is.
So
It's
it's got to be done right.
It absolutely is. That's right. And there has to be an opening for it. I mean, I think based on what we're saying, the person has to be past that anger state. If they're just still spewing anger a lot, to ask them, would you consider an apology?
Sometimes it'll be raised by the other. I mean,
That's-
somebody says, "Hey, I'd like an apology,"
Yep,
and it
yep.
gives you as a mediator an opening to talk to the other side and say, "Hey, I think maybe one of the ways out of this, or a way to break the impasse, is."
From what I'm hearing in that room, what I just heard is that really what sounds like it might be even more important than some of these other things we're talking about is if you would express a genuine, and I think they're willing to as well, if you do maybe. What do you think about that? I think that's absolutely appropriate.
Personally, I would never ask the participants to apologize to one another unless one of them brings it up.
Specifically. Yeah.
And even then, I think one of the things that I've always found is that when people are looking for an apology, normally they're looking for more than just that. They're looking for accountability, or they're looking for recognition of their own acts, or things like that. And so trying to delve into what are those pieces that they're really looking for.
That's a great point. And again, two things. Number one is what you do is you ask them, what are you looking for today? What's important to you? Give me. We talked about a number of things. What's most important to you? And if they say apology, that's the opening. But number two is just what we was talking about. An apology isn't just a "I'm sorry." That's not an apology that at least doesn't get me off the couch that night. It has to be a lot more than that. It has to be a genuine expression. You can't. Well, some people can fake it, I'm afraid, but most people can't, and most people can sense when it's real and whether the person means it. So if they can't, inside them, really genuinely feel that they should apologize and that they're sorry and say why and what the implication of that is, what does that mean for the future? If they can't do that, you're absolutely right. It backfires, and it's not. It can borderline on manipulative again. I think there's no question you have to be very, very careful with it. And again, the underlying thing is it has to come from them. I mean, it has to be inside them. It has to be the place that they're in. And that's as I say, the hardest part of being a mediator is that patience and willingness to accept that maybe it's not. And even though I want my settlement rate to be better, and I want to impress that judge that we're bringing this case back settled, that's not the most important consideration. It really isn't from the standpoint of actually what needs to happen and what would be best if it happens. So I think you got it just right. I think that's exactly right.
I think that a very important aspect of all of this that we haven't touched upon, and maybe you could, is to establish beyond any doubt that you're impartial and you're not favoring one party over the other.
Yes.
Because the parties do form that impression that you're, favoring him and not her.
That's right.
Or whatever. So how do you...
Well, yeah. So that's to me, that's often body language and actually the wording that you use. And that's why... number one, that's why I like an initial meeting with people, because I build a relationship where they can't question it. If I've sat there and listened to them for 15 minutes and they haven't seen me, I was in a separate room with the other person, then it's you start to establish it and it's there. I think people's perceptions when they're in conflict, definitely the way their brain works and their perceptions of things. And sometimes, as I say, it's body language. Sometimes it's just who you are. So when we do set up mediations, what we really try to do is set up a diverse team of mediators. And sometimes it's inevitable, just by the fact of how you look. Their bias is going to they're going to be more on the defensive or whatever. So I think that makes a difference. The importance of a team, a diverse team. But I think also. It gets to what we talked about. Always get your ego out of it. As a mediator, if you see a party is by their body language is reacting badly to what you're doing or feeling that this process isn't fair, then you need to do something about it, and you need to take responsibility for it and say, this process being fair is really important to me. And again, this would be in a caucus. I sense that that you may not feel that way. So tell me more. I want to hear about that and tell me more about it. And what could we do to fix that, perhaps? And it may be that person, as I say, the emotions are too high in the room at the time, so you need to do some private caucusing for a while to build the trust and to get it so they can be in the room together even. Because the past, the trauma or whatever reason, some people's brains are just, they're on edge and they're going to be that way. And they might need more than you can provide, as a mediator. But you try every tool in your toolkit and you say, I apologize. And I was in a mediation recently where that happened. The mediator kind of shut down someone early in the mediation when they were sort of trying to tell their story, and it wasn't nice, and they were being, kind of nasty about it, and they kind of shut them down. And I saw right away that person, wasn't. As long as they saw that, we were doomed. And so we worked really hard to get past that, and we did a caucus and did. But it's a real challenge, and that's, again, your human instinct is, I want to resolve this problem, and when one of the parties is pushing your buttons too, reminding you of your teenage son who, just did something really stupid last night or whatever, you just got to pull that back and close your mouth, other than to just listen. That's the patience.
There's also the chance that the party may want to ingratiate himself or herself.
Right.
With the mediator.
Oh, see it all the time. Absolutely. There's no question. All right, we hit our 1 o'clock. Thank you. I enjoyed your good comments and thoughts.